And in disciplinary MindCORE fashion, Sam is working in psychology and in linguistics and in philosophy. He's in the second year of his postdoc. And he did his PhD at Oxford, where he philosophized about the relationship between cognition and perception, and then went on to do a postdoc at York, where he got deeply entrenched in philosophical issues in the about the number sets, and that's where most of his heart still is right now, I think, and we'll hear about that today. And he'll be moving on next year to an assistant professor position at University of South Carolina. That's right, California. Yeah. So.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for having me. You know, in general, my friends and family don't really let me talk to them about my work. So, you know, it's great that I can just talk at people uninterrupted about essentially whatever I want. So what I do want to talk about today is kind of an orthodox view in developmental psychology, comparative psychology, and vision science. And according to this orthodox view, humans and many non-human animals possess what Stan DeHaan calls a number sense, or what researchers more commonly refer to as an approximate number system. Now, evidence for this system is found in a wide range of creatures. These include fish, rats, pigeons, monkeys, infants, even newborn infants, so babies that have just been born, pre-numerate human children who haven't yet learned to count, human adults whose language lacks precise number words, like a word for the number 7, and of course, all of us. So cumulatively, this is taken to suggest that this approximate number system is really quite widespread in nature, that it operates independently of natural language, and that it's probably innate in some substantial sense of the term. It affords creatures with an innate capacity to represent numbers. But I guess not everyone is completely sold on this orthodox view. And I suppose the most obvious challenge to it comes from various theorists who just flat out deny that this approximate number system or the relevant mechanisms and processes are really in the business of representing number at all. So on the one hand, some critics propose that what looks like genuine numerical cognition is in fact the result of mechanisms and processes that simply track and represent non-numerical stuff. So when it looks like a monkey is keeping track of the number of dots in an array, critics of this ilk might try and explain this away, proposing that really the monkey's just keeping track of things like the total surface area of the dots or the density of the array, so forth. It's not really representing anything numerical. On the other hand, I think more plausibly, various critics argue that strictly speaking, the approximate number system doesn't represent numbers, at least not numbers of a sort we might discuss in the maths class. Really, it just represents some primitive analog of these. And if you even kind of just like dip into the literature on the approximate number system, you kind of are immediately struck by the fact that many theorists just kind of assiduously avoid using the term number to describe what the system's representing, and instead employ all these neologisms. So they describe the system as representing numerosities, or if you're Rafael Nunez, quantical dimensions, or in the case of Tyler Burge, pure magnitudes. And some of the time, I think this is just loose talk. People just aren't, you know, scrutinizing what they're saying. But often enough, these theorists are completely explicit that they're using these terms because they don't want to commit themselves to the idea that the system is really representing numbers in any substantive sense. And so what I want to do in this talk is just respond to these challenges and suggest that the orthodox view is right. The approximate number system really does exist, and it really is in the business of tracking and representing numbers of just a really boring, mundane sort. So here's the plan. Oh, I got stuck. Okay, I'm going to start by just introducing the approximate number system a little bit more, saying a little bit about the evidence for it. I'm then going to introduce what I take to be the most prominent argument against the idea that this system represents numbers. This is an argument that I've labeled the argument for imprecision. I'm going to suggest it's just a bad argument. We should just forget about it. And finally, I'm going to consider whether it might still be better to say that the system is in the business of representing some primitive analog of number rather than number of a literal, genuine sort. And I'll suggest that it's not. We do actually have some really good reasons for thinking the system's representing numbers in the fullest sense of the term. Okay, so there's lots that could be said about the approximate number system, but the thing that's going to be really important for the purposes of today's talk is that unlike other numerical systems that have been posited in humans and other animals, the approximate number system seems to be distinctive in that its numerical discriminations conform to Weber's law. So the details of Weber's law don't really matter, but the basic idea is just that unlike other numerical systems that have been posited in humans and other animals, the approximate number system's ability to discriminate two numerical quantities is predicted by the ratio between them. So the system will be better at saying that 8 is less than 10 than that 10 is less than 12, even though both differ by the same absolute amount. What matters is the ratio. The further from 1 to 1, the better. So I know that everyone kind of hates audience participation, but I think the easiest way to get your head around this is just to experience it for yourself. So in a moment, I'll present you with two arrays of dots in quick succession. If you don't have like pizza in your mouth, you can shout out 1 if the first array contains more, and 2 if the second array does. So here we go. Let's see how you guys do. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Easy. How about this one? 3, 2, 1.
1.
Good. And how about this one? 3, 2, 1. Right, yeah. So I feel like there were more 1s than 2s, but there was definitely a lot more uncertainty there. So the first array did contain more. It contained 16 dots. The second array contained 14. Even if you got it right, you probably felt less certainty about your answer in that last case. And that's because the ratio in the number of dots was closer to 1 to 1. 8 to 7, much closer to 1 to 1 than in the first two examples. Now, of course, this kind of like quick, dirty illustration of the basic idea isn't going to convince anyone that an approximate number system exists unless you already think it does. But of course, psychologists and cognitive scientists have run loads and loads of really elegant, carefully designed experiments that really speak to this hypothesis. And I want to introduce just one experiment, which I think is particularly beautiful and elegant and does a really nice job of illustrating the motivations for the existence of an approximate number system, which is a study by Hilary Barth and colleagues from 2005. So in this study, Barth and colleagues presented preschoolers, kids who had never sat through a maths class and still weren't very good at counting, with the following sequence of events. The kids would look at a screen, and onto this screen would move a collection of blue dots. This would be pointed out to the kids. An occluding block would then slide across the screen and block the collection of blue dots from view, at which point a second collection of dots would move onto the screen. At this point, the experimenters would just ask the children, were there more blue dots or more red dots? And as you've probably already anticipated, the children could answer this question provided the collections differed by a suitably large ratio. So while they were, while they'd not yet learned to count, they'd never sat through a maths class, they were able to say pretty reliably whether there were more blue dots or more red dots, but their performance was ratio sensitive. They did better when there was a 4:7 ratio of blue to red dots than when there was a 4:6 ratio. They did better when there was a 4:6 ratio than when there was a 4:5 ratio. Now, what I think is more exciting is that Barth and colleagues then ran a cross-modal version of the same study. So again, the kids would look at a screen, onto this would move a collection of blue dots, an occluding block would slide across the screen and block these from view, just like in the first experiment. But at this point, the experimenters would tell the children, okay, now you're going to hear a sequence of heard tones. Beep, 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 beep. At which point, they'd ask the children, were there more blue dots or more heard tones? And the remarkable result, I think it's stunning, was that the children weren't just able to answer this question, but they were actually as good in this cross-modal version of the task as they were in the original visual-to-visual comparison task. So why am I jumping up and down about this? Well, the point to note is that cross-modal studies of this sort, and there are lots, this is just one example of many, naturally eliminate many, many non-numerical confounds that you might be worried about contaminating results in these allegedly numerical comparison tasks. So in a visual to visual comparison task, you might worry that maybe the children weren't comparing the number of dots. Maybe they were just comparing things like the total surface area of the dots, or the density of the arrays, or the convex hull of the collection. But the point to note is that a sequence of heard tones has none of these properties. So were you waving? Because I've okay. So yeah, a sequence of heard tones just has none of these properties. And conversely, properties of the heard tones just don't seem to be present in the seen dots. You know, the seen dots don't have a sort of total loudness, the duration was controlled for, and so forth. So cross-modal studies of this sort provide really, really powerful evidence that the approximate number system really is abstracting away from these non-numerical compounds and tracking and representing numerical quantities. Yeah.
I'm curious whether or not you think it has something to do fundamentally with the cross-modal nature of that conditioning experiment, or the fact that the visual presentation of stimuli weren't actually staggered with the auditory work. So you can imagine doing a visual version of this cross-modal study where the red dots were temporarily staggered and the blue dots were not. And that was then eliminating that correspondence between cross-modality and the spatial perspective.
Right. So maybe I'm not quite getting it, but wouldn't that actually kind of introduce new compounds? So if there was, I mean, you could make sure that the, yeah. So there definitely are studies where, for instance, people have to tap a button a certain number of times, which is a kind of sequential operation. Yeah, I'm trying to think whether those studies ever have a visual element or clear. I'm not sure, but yeah, I mean, it would be another way. You know, there's loads and loads of experiments. This is just one nice one, which I think does a nice job of eliminating compounds. But yeah, this isn't the only study. There's lots more. Okay, so studies of this sort naturally eliminate compounds. But despite evidence of this sort, various theorists still object to the idea that the approximate number system is really representing number. And I think the most prominent argument against this suggestion is this argument I'm going to call the argument for imprecision. So the argument for imprecision actually pops up all over the literature on numerical cognition. But in its generic form, the argument just proceeds as follows. So first of all, critics start by pointing out that the approximate number system's numerical discriminations are imprecise in some way or another. So as we've seen, they conform to Weber's law. And so in that sense, the approximate number system seems to treat 4 and 5 as more different, or at least more reliably discriminable than 9 and 10, even though they differ by the same absolute amount. But of course, numbers themselves are essentially precise. 22 is exactly 1 more than 21, 1 less than 23. So the argument goes, the approximate number system isn't really representing numbers. Now, there's loads and loads of problems with this argument, as I've just stated it. But before I kind of introduce some problems, I want to just allude to a couple of places in literature where this argument pops up, a couple of prominent places, just to convince you that I'm not just making this up. So one place where it pops up is in Susan Carey's incredible book. I love this book. It's just a pity that she seems to appeal to the argument for imprecision. So she seems to appeal to the argument for imprecision when she writes, in some analog magnitude representations, by which she means approximate number representations, are not powerful enough to represent the natural numbers. Why not? Because they do not provide exact representations of numbers, and they obscure the successor function, which is constitutive natural number. So here, Carey's pointing out that it seems to be an essential feature of natural numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that each one is exactly 1 more than its predecessor, that they conform to the successor function. And because the approximate number system is imprecise, it fails to capture this, and therefore, she concludes, isn't really representing natural numbers at all. I think even more strident in this regard would be Rafael Nunes. So in this 2017 TICS paper, he just endlessly appeals to the argument for imprecision. So here's one point where he says, a basic competence involving, say, the number 8 should require that the quantity is treated as being categorically different from 7 and not merely treated as often or highly likely to be different from it. On this basis, he concludes that the quantity-related capacities observed in infants and non-human animals are not about numbers, but are about quantity, and therefore should not qualify as numerical. I propose to refer to these biologically endowed capacities as quantical, in contrast to numerical. So again, Nunes is pointing out the fact that these numerical abilities are imprecise in some way or another, and on this basis, he's concluding that they're not numerical at all. He introduces this term quantical to capture what these systems might be representing. But the problem with all of this is that the argument for imprecision, as we've stated it, is just logically invalid. So the mere fact that the approximate number system is imprecise, coupled with the fact that numbers themselves are essentially precise, fails to imply or even suggest that the approximate number system wouldn't be representing numbers. And the reason for this is just that there's nothing puzzling in the idea that a precise quantity might be represented imprecisely. So this is just obvious when it comes to non-numerical quantities. So properties like weight and height can be represented precisely. So I might represent someone's precise weight precisely when I say they're exactly 240 pounds or exactly 175 centimeters tall. But I might also represent these same quantities imprecisely, as when I say that person's about as heavy as an NFL linebacker or a little shorter than a doorway. In both cases, I'm referring to the same quantity, weight and height respectively. What differs is just how precisely I'm purporting to represent it. And what's true of non-numerical quantities also seems to be true of numerical quantities. So a precise number might be represented precisely as when I say there are exactly 6 coins in my pocket or a dozen eggs in the fridge. But this same quantity might be represented imprecisely as when I say there are approximately 6 coins in my pocket or a few eggs in the fridge. In both cases, I'm referring to the same quantity, the same kind of thing, number, or numerical quantity. What differs is just how precisely I'm purporting to represent it. So given this, which I think is a fairly straightforward point, why is it that so many theorists seem to endorse this argument for imprecision? Well, what I think is that they're tacitly assuming something like the following sensitivity principle. They're assuming that if some entity X has some property Y essentially, then representing X requires being sensitive to Y. Now, the point to note is that if this sensitivity principle was true, it would actually fix the argument. It would render it valid. The conclusion would actually follow from the premises. But the problem is the sensitivity principle is just false. So thinking about how much you'd like a gold watch doesn't require any sensitivity to essential properties of gold, like its atomic number being 79. In fact, it doesn't even require a sensitivity to the difference between gold and fool's gold. So many people who are just ignorant of chemistry and metallurgy nevertheless think about gold. And what's true of thought also seems to be true of perception. So it seems to be an essential property of many of the continuous magnitudes that we perceptually represent, things like distances, durations, weights, and that these are continuous. So in between any two values, there always seems to be a third intermediate value. But while we perceptually represent these kinds of quantities and magnitude, don't know if the video is going to work. Oh well, that's a pity. This was supposed to be a video. But even though we perceptually represent these continuous magnitudes, our visual systems and other perceptual systems have a kind of limited resolution that prevents us from being fully sensitive to their density. Oh, there we go. So in representing motion, for instance, we rely on Reichardt detectors in our eyes, which are not sensitive to the difference between continuous movements and discrete changes in location. This is why turning on a succession of Christmas lights quickly gives rise to this illusion of motion, the phi phenomenon. So given all of this, I think we should just reject the sensitivity principle. It's just not true. But as a result, proponents of the argument for imprecision owe us some as yet unstated reason why the fact that the approximate number system is imprecise, coupled with the fact that numbers themselves are essentially precise, should imply that the approximate number system isn't representing numbers. And while there's lots that could be said on this, I have a very long paper. I don't really think there are very many plausible suggestions kicking around. So let's just forget about the argument for imprecision. It's a bad argument. At this point, you might be thinking, well, look, maybe the approximate number system wouldn't need to be sensitive to the precise nature of numbers in order to literally represent these. But you might still be thinking, you might still be wondering whether we really have good reason to think that the system is in the business of representing numbers of a sort we might discuss in the maths class. And what I want to suggest very briefly is that I think we do have a few of these. For one thing, the approximate number system does seem to be sensitive to certain properties that seem to be unique to or distinctive of numbers. So for one thing, numbers seem to have a higher order character that non-numerical magnitudes lack. So this is a kind of technical suggestion from metaphysics, but I think the basic idea is pretty straightforward. The idea is that numbers, unlike other kinds of magnitudes, can only be assigned relative to a sortal or some criterion for individuating the entities being counted. So as Frege, philosopher and logician around the turn of the century, 20th century, 19th, 20th century, posited or proposed, the question, how many boots are in the closet, just seems to be ill-posed, right? If you want to know how many boots there are in the closet, you need to first decide whether you're counting individual boots or pairs of boots. If there are no boots missing, you're going to have half as many pairs as you do individual boots. So the entity that's actually being counted needs to be specified, because this is going to make a real difference to your answer. But as Frege observed, other magnitudes aren't like this. So if you want to know how much the boots in the closet weigh, you can just toss them on the scales and read off your answer. It doesn't make a blind bit of difference whether you think of them as individual boots, pairs of boots, types of boots, and so forth. So in this way, numbers have long been seen to have a second or higher order character that other magnitudes lack. Now, I think the reason why this is important to note is that whether or not researchers realize it, when they're studying the approximate number system, they seem to be in the business of studying a system that's specifically in the business of tracking magnitudes with this higher order character. And I think this comes out really nicely in an experiment pioneered by Steve Frankineri and colleagues back in 2009. So in their study, they presented subjects with arrays containing circles and thin lines. And as with many of the studies I've already mentioned, the subjects were tasked with just saying which array contains more circles. But at the same time, they were explicitly told to just try and ignore the thin lines as best they could. And what Frankineri and colleagues found was that when the thin lines connected pairs of circles, effectively turning pairs of circles into single dumbbell-shaped objects, this caused subjects to systematically underestimate the number of items in the array. So it was as if their visual system couldn't help but treat single dumbbell-shaped objects as single items. So in this way, it looks like their visual system really was taking a stand on how the items in the array were being carved up and individuated. But in this sense, it wasn't just tracking a first order quantity like weight, rather it was tracking some quantity with a higher order character, like the number of boots in Frege's closet, which seems tantamount to saying it was in the business of representing some kind of number. So at this point, I've amassed a few considerations in favor of the view that the approximate number system really does represent number. So firstly, the most prominent argument against this suggestion, the argument for imprecision, just seems to be unsound. It's a bad argument. We should forget about it. Secondly, many studies do seem to rule out non-numerical confounds that you might worry about, contaminating these kinds of results. So we saw that in the really nice study by Hilary Barth and colleagues at the beginning of this talk, where they got kids to perform these cross-modal comparisons. Very hard to see how they could be doing that without locking onto something numerical in abstraction from the non-numerical properties of the stimuli. And finally, we've seen that the approximate number system does seem to be sensitive to certain properties that really are distinctive of and have traditionally been seen as unique to numbers. namely their higher order character. Now, as a final point, you might still be worried that these approximate number system representations that we find in children, rats, monkeys, fish, are just very, very different from the mature number concepts that most of us have at our disposal and bring to bear when we're in the maths class. And this might kind of contribute to a lingering worry that maybe the approximate number system isn't really representing numbers in the fullest sense of the term after all. But very briefly, I just want to suggest or point out that really there are two different explanations, or at least two explanations, for this apparent difference. So one possibility is that these systems of representation differ because they do actually represent different things after all. So while our mature number concepts represent actual numbers like 7, maybe our approximate number system really does just represent some primitive analog of this. After all, some kind of numerosity. But an alternative explanation is that both these systems of representation represent exactly the same thing. They both represent numbers, they just differ in how they do so. They differ in what philosophers of language would call their mode of presentation. So as Frege, again, he's looming large in this talk, kind of famously pointed out, names can differ in what we might intuitively think of as their meaning, while referring to the same object. So as he pointed out, Hesperus and Phosphorus were these two names that it turned out both referred to a single item, namely Venus. Despite this, it was obviously a substantive discovery that these two things co-referred. And this is not just true of names in natural language, it also seems to be true of our thoughts. So the Babylonians' concepts of Hesperus and Phosphorus differed in their mode of presentation in the same way. Again, it was a kind of substantive discovery for them to realize that their concept of Hesperus and their concept of Phosphorus were actually about the same item out there in the world. And what's true of thought also seems to be true of perception. So in the 80s, Christopher Peacock pointed out that knowing the length of your sofa in feet and inches may not actually settle the question of whether it's going to fit against your new living room wall, even if you're looking straight at the living room wall. And the reason for this isn't that your perceptual representation of the wall's length differs in what it represents from your thought about it being 6 feet and 5 inches long. No, it's just that these two representations, while they represent the same thing, differ in how they do so. They refer to the same thing, but they differ in their mode of presentation, a bit like different languages or something. And so given all the evidence that I've amassed so far, I just want to suggest that this is the most natural thing to say about how our approximate number system representations differ from our mature number concepts. They both refer to the same thing. They're both about numbers. They just differ in their mode of presentation in precisely the same way. So this is a very short version of a much longer paper that I wrote with Jake Beck. You can check it out or avoid it as you see fit. But thank you very much for listening.
That was a fabulous talk. So just as a follow-up question on the last point you landed on. So the argument of reference as raised by Frege, it's assuming a kind of an ontological reality. But a lot of philosophers argue that numbers is not something like that, which means it's not a platonic world where numbers exist. I'm just curious whether you want to speak to that, whether this would be just a linguistic confusion of what you mean by number if it's not an ontologically real object.
Yeah, so I mean, there's two things to say. So I guess what you're pointing out is that, yeah, there are lots of different views of like what numbers are. And on some of those views, it's a lot easier to see how we could be like referring to those, like our thoughts could literally be like pointing at that thing out there in the world. One thing to say is, suppose we take an extreme position, we just think numbers just don't exist. We're just kind of nominalists about this. I take it that anyone that appeals to reference is still going to need to explain how it is that our thoughts and words can actually refer to things that don't exist. So it seems like we can have thoughts about unicorns and things like that. Our thoughts seem to refer to those. So this is a kind of long-standing problem, but I just kind of take heart in the fact that it's a problem for everyone, if you want to go down that route. And of course, there's been loads and loads of suggestions, so at least since Frege. There's just been lots and lots of work on this question. But the other thing is that, just because you mentioned kind of Platonism, so Plato, this realm of ideas out there in Plato's heaven, a lot of people would say you don't need that, right, for them to be real. So you might think that these are like real structural entities. They're actually things in the world. It's just, they kind of have a highly abstract nature. So anyway, basically, I just think there's a bunch of options. But even if we take kind of like what looks like the worst option for this kind of referential account, we just say numbers don't exist, there's still going to need to be some explanation of how we can refer to things that don't exist, like unicorns and so forth. So,
Question from Zoom from mean for these to be numerical quantities? What is the content consequence of calling this number rather than numerosity? What is the mode of representation?
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of funny because like sometimes I like talk to people and they're like, oh, like why do you do what you do? What's the real world consequence? I guess I just think in general it's really hard to predict what the real world consequence of anything is. But one thing which I do think is kind of important here is first of all that scientists and theorists are kind of just wasting their time if they're trying to make up these new entities, things like numerosities, and spell out what those might be if there's just a really simple explanation of what's going on. We don't need these extra entities in our ontology. These are just kind of, it's a waste of time thinking about those. I think our efforts are better spent trying to understand the computations that the system's actually performing that give rise to things like its imprecision and so forth. We don't need to worry about these issues. But more generally, I think it is important to understand what psychological systems are doing. That's ultimately what we care about. And so the question of whether or not the approximate number system really is in the business of performing genuine numerical computations seems to me to be like the most important question about the approximate number system. I mean, it's theoretical in nature, but I think ultimately theoretical questions are the most important ones. So, yeah.
We'll take one more question while Sami sets up.
Sorry.
Nice talk, and I apologize for being late. You might have said this, but I might have missed it, which is, I'm sorry. How are you defining the number sense or the approximate number system? Because at some point in the talk you mentioned these babies.
Yeah.
And maybe, if you could buy this, or whatever. So you kind of like to define this behavior rather than how it's
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I've actually just written a grant proposal for working on some of these issues. I am super interested. I mean, my background is really working in cognitive architecture. But for the purposes of this talk, I guess I'm just appealing to kind of like Marian computational level description of the system. So what I take to be distinctive of the approximate number system is that it's a system that, if I'm right, really does represent numbers and represents them in this distinctive way. Discriminations, conform favors, law, and so forth. So that leaves open what algorithms are actually implementing it and further what neural mechanisms are implementing it. But I actually think this is important because I think a lot of people think of the approximate number system as just like this single module in the head, and I guess I don't really think that's very plausible. I think there's just going to be lots and lots of mechanisms working in tandem to extract number, a bit like how in vector distance perception we think of spatial disparity, parallax, so forth, all being kind of computed over in parallel. I'm just thinking of this in computational terms for purposes of this talk. Yeah.
Thank you, Sam.
about that paper later, but if you're interested in more of these ideas, definitely feel free to talk to me or refer to that paper, because I think there's a lot more that won't get impacted here today. My title slide is, since we're talking about spatial representation today, I thought we'd start with a picture of a map. But this isn't just any ordinary map. This is actually a pretty famous map in the history of cartography. So this map was drawn by Leonardo da Vinci in 1502. It's a map of the city of Imola in northern Italy. And to get a sense of why this map is so famous and important, maybe it helps to contrast it with what a typical map at that time would look like. So this is a map of the city of Venice drawn about the same time, around 1500. And you'll notice that it has a very different style. We might say that it has a very different format. Primarily, typical maps of the time would have this perspectival view. So you're seeing sort of a 3D representation of the space. And that has some advantages. Maybe it seems more grand in some ways. But there's lots of things that are wrong with it. Some things are obscured. You can't see all the buildings, and there's major scale problems. You can see that the ships in the foreground look massive compared to some of the buildings farther back. And so it's not a perfect representation of anything meaningful or precise about the space that's being represented. If you just look carefully at the map, you can actually see these radial lines extending from the center every 45 degrees. And if you look closer, you can actually see these more subtle lines, like here every 5 degrees or so. And so what Da Vinci is doing is he's getting a bird's eye view of the city of Imola that's capturing the precise angle and distance relations of this space. And this is not typical for how maps were drawn at the time, because it's not easy to do this and it requires a lot of effort and math to do it. But this map captures something that the other map couldn't. And so what I want everyone to appreciate is that it's the same kind of thing. It's a map of a city around the same time, but it's capturing different pieces of information. It's represented in a different format. Beyond the case of the maps, though, I want to make the case for why we might care about this issue of format more generally. So imagine the following thought experiment for a second. Imagine that we took a modern computer like we're all familiar with, but we sent it through a time machine. And all the scientists and intellectuals together to try to understand how that machine works. And so let's say it has infinite battery life. They can take it apart and put it back together as much as they want to try to understand how the machine works. So you can probably imagine that after playing around and clicking around for a bit, they would start to understand the behavior of the machine. They would start to understand at a high level what programs and processes are on the machine and how they interact. You would understand what Word is doing and how it's different from Microsoft Excel and so on and so forth. But if you understood everything perfectly about how these things work, it wouldn't be fair to say that you understand how the computer works. Because of course, there's also this low-level implementation that's sort of necessary for understanding how the machine works. You have to understand not just the hardware, but also the software, or not just software, but also the hardware. But what I want to argue is that even if you understood both of these things perfectly, if you've understood everything about the behavior of the machine, and you've also understood everything about the hardware of the machine, you still wouldn't understand how it works. Because at every level between the hardware and the software, there are different levels on which the information is organized or formatted that are sort of essential to how the machine operates. So every level of organization between hardware and software we might refer to as a kind of format, and that is an intermediate level of representation that is critical to understand for understanding how the computer works. And so the critical enterprise for me is to understand these intermediate levels of representation in the human mind as much as possible. So positioned between something like high-level psychology and sort of low-level neuroscience, there's everything between, which I think is what cognitive science mostly concerns itself with. And so that's what my talk is going to be about today. Of course, a natural question arises then about how we can assess these intermediate levels of representation in the human mind. And for me, that means starting with space. So as was mentioned, I've worked on a lot of different things, not all of which are space, but space is sort of the central case study through which I look at the human mind. And the reason for that is simple. Number one, space is obviously vital to everything that we do. In order to navigate, in order to perceive the space around us, we need to have a representation of space. Spatial representations are something that we share with many other organisms. So if we want to look at other instances of spatial representation in other minds, we have a lot of examples that we can look to. And also, it just is very convenient that we happen to know a lot about how humans and other animals represent space. So if we want to know about the formats of representation, space is a good case study to begin with. And my approach within this domain is to look closely at the errors that people make. So what I want to suggest today is that in the ordinary spatial judgments that we're making all the time when we're reaching to pick up our water bottle at the table, or we're remembering where our car is parked in the parking lot, we make tiny errors all the time. And those errors are going to reveal something deep and interesting, hopefully interesting, about the format of representations. And so just to make this concrete, it might help to consider that you've parked your car in a busy parking lot and you've left it there for some time, and you're going to come back after a week, let's say, and you're going to try to remember where your car was parked. And we might think that there's a couple different ways that you could remember where the car is parked. Oh, okay, great, thank you. So imagine that we think that what we're doing is representing sort of like the horizontal and vertical relations of the different dimensions of the parking lot, and that's how they're going to remember where their car is parked, right? So you might make an error in the horizontal dimension, and so you might misplace your car being over here, or you might make an error in the vertical dimension, so you might misplace your car being here. But you can get a sense of the kinds of errors that someone would make if you think that there's this sort of underlying format of the representation. But this isn't the only way that you might represent where the car is parked. You might think that what someone is doing is representing almost like the aspect ratio of the rectangle drawn from the corner of the parking lot to where the car is, something like this. And then you might think that someone would make an error like this. They're representing a similar rectangle, but just smaller, or they're representing a similar rectangle, but larger. And then you can see how you would predict that people's errors are going to be along this diagonal axis, just depending on how you think people are representing the space. So this is a simplified example. My work doesn't concern itself with how people remember where cars are parked. But what I'm going to talk about today is the difference between Cartesian coordinates and polar coordinates. The reason for thinking about a contrast between Cartesian coordinates and polar coordinates is because these are two viable candidates for how you might represent two-dimensional space. And indeed, these are the most common ways that we think about two-dimensional space, at least in mathematics. And one very important point that I hope everyone can recognize here is that it's not as if Cartesian coordinates or polar coordinates are capturing different information, or it's not as if one is doing it better than the other. Both Cartesian coordinates and polar coordinates are capturing the same 2D relations with an equal level of precision. They're just doing it in a different format. And so what I'm going to be asking is, can we uncover whether human spatial relations traffic in one of these formats or not? And I'm using what's called an error correlation analysis. This is my term. And I just want to say at the outset that this is something that I'm using to understand spatial representation, but I think this is something that can be used by probably every single person in this room to understand whatever things you've studied in some form or fashion. So here's the basic idea. I'm going to go through this slowly because it's really central to my talk. But suppose your task now is not to remember a car in a parking lot, but just remember where this blue point is relative to this central black mark. And let's say we're hypothesizing that someone is representing this location of the blue dot in Cartesian coordinates. So there's an x dimension and a y dimension. We might say then that the mind is representing a two-dimensional vector that contains one dimension for x and one dimension for y. But of course, people make mistakes. There's some errors, there's noise in the representation. And so we might say, along with each vector, there's a separate sort of parameter for noise, basically. Right? So you're going to make some dimension or some error in the x dimension, some error in the y dimension. And the critical point here is that if we think these are separate dimensions, then we should think that the noise associated with each of them is also independent. And therefore that the errors that people make in these dimensions are also independent. So when we think about a different coordinate system, say polar coordinates, now we have two different dimensions. Now we're talking about angle and distance. And now we have two separate sets of errors that we're making a different prediction about the ways that those would be correlated or uncorrelated. So we think people are using polar coordinates, we should expect that the errors in polar coordinates are uncorrelated. And now with both of these thoughts in mind, we can use this idea to make an inference, perhaps, from the errors that people make about which coordinate system is being represented. Namely, the suggestion would be that if errors are uncorrelated, that would suggest that the errors are independent, and therefore that coordinate system is a likely candidate for a possible format of spatial representation. So that's the basic idea. And just to make this a little bit more concrete, so you can kind of imagine how it could be that some coordinate systems could be correlated and some could be uncorrelated. Imagine a specific type of error that a person might make. So imagine that they're remembering where this blue point is, and they misplace it in some way. Let's say they misplace it up and to the right. So in this case, no error has been made in the angle dimension, so they're moving along the same sort of angular trajectory, but an error has been made in the distance dimension, shown in red, and an error has been made in the x and y dimensions, shown in yellow. You can think about what that does to these vectors that I've plotted below, right? In this case, the angle hasn't changed, but the distance has increased, but the x and y errors have both increased. And so it's easy to imagine how if someone was making these kinds of errors over and over again throughout a task, you might see that the polar errors are uncorrelated and the Cartesian errors are correlated. This works the exact same in the reverse, by the way. You can imagine cases where the Cartesian errors would be uncorrelated and polar errors would be correlated, but I've just shown one for the sake of example. Okay, so again, I want to emphasize it's the lack of a correlation that's interesting here. We're looking for the absence of something, and that's pretty important to this approach that we're taking. So in our task, I guess something's being cut off at the top there, but that's no big deal. In our task, we're just trying to give people an opportunity to make errors in space. That's all we're trying to do. So we have people performing this very simple location matching task where they're going to see a set of shapes in the top left, and they're going to try to match them in the bottom right So here, their task would be to place the red diamond in the green triangle in the display such that the relative positions are matched. And in this particular condition, they're going to be scaling the display up by a factor of 2. Participants are told that, they know that, and they can do this successfully. So you can tell from the fact that the blue circle on the bottom right was larger that you're going to scale the display up by a factor of 2. So they're doing a very simple location matching task, but they have to scale the size of it. Okay. And the point of this is just to let people make errors, the normal errors that they would make. And so what we're going to do for each trial, very simply, is we're going to look at the error that they make in the x dimension and in the y dimension and in the angle dimension and the distance dimension. And we're going to look at the correlations within the different coordinate systems. So if we're predicting that people are using polar coordinates, for instance, then we should predict that polar errors are uncorrelated and that Cartesian errors are correlated. That is the basic idea. So with all of that intro out of the way, here is what we actually find. So in the first experiment, we do exactly what I just said. We're just having people do this location matching task. Here's some data. So on the y-axis, we have the average correlation. So for each person across all the trials that they do, we're going to get the correlation between the errors in the Cartesian dimensions and in the polar dimensions. And then we're going to average that across all the subjects. And this is what we're left with. On the x-axis, we just have the first point that they placed, the second point that they placed, and then the average of the two. And so what we find here shown in blue is the errors in the Cartesian dimensions. We can see that they're reliably correlated. And for the polar dimensions, the errors are reliably uncorrelated, essentially. You can look at this broken down by person in the experiment. So on the y-axis, we just have individual observers. So every green bar here is a person. And on the x-axis, we have the difference between the Cartesian correlation and the polar correlation. So anything to the right of the axis is indicating that someone has a higher correlation for Cartesian coordinates than polar coordinates. And really all this means is that every single person in our experiment is showing this effect. Reminder, it's the lack of correlation that implies that the dimensions are independent, and therefore it's the lack of correlation for the polar errors that's indicating that polar coordinates are a likely candidate for possible format. In a second experiment, we basically just replicate this idea with a slightly different sort of display. So now people are placing 3 objects relative to 1 central object, and we find exactly the same thing. Cartesian errors are correlated and polar errors are not, and this is true for virtually every person that we tested. In a third experiment, we extend this in a slightly different way. So this is a subtle distinction, but basically we removed the scaling component from the task. So now people are matching exactly what they're seeing on the screen. And I'll also add, this isn't a memory task. So what they're seeing is quite literally what you guys are seeing on the screen now. They're matching exactly what they see. So it should be very easy, and we're making only very, very small errors on the order of, several pixels sometimes. Yeah. Yeah, so the question for anyone who may not have been able to hear is about the proximity of the pieces relative to the boundary, let's say, and whether the boundary is implying purpose space or something. It certainly could be something that people are representing, but for the critical thing they need to represent and the critical thing they need to place, the boundary can't help them in any way, right? So if you're thinking about where the green is relative to the red square, it's not going to matter, essentially, where you are relative to the boundary. So in some other experiments that I won't be showing today, we play around with how boundaries might be influencing these things. But for the sake of what I'm arguing here, we don't think that would play a factor, but it's a great question. Thank you. So in this third experiment, all we're doing is removing the scaling component. And we find the same thing. Cartesian errors are correlated, polar errors are correlated to a lesser extent, and every single person shows this effect. Now, you might be wondering why the polar errors are slightly correlated in this case. Unfortunately, the answer is not that interesting. There was one person who was a massive outlier in this, but wasn't quite captured by our exclusion criteria that we pre-registered, so we left it in. But suffice to say that Cartesian errors are reliably correlated, polar errors are not in the 3 experiments that we've shown so far. So then the question becomes, is it just true that humans use polar coordinates to represent space? And at the time that we ran these 3 experiments, we were thinking along these lines, that maybe polar coordinates are just the format of the representation of location. But when we submitted this to a journal, the editor said, can you push this around? Can you basically push people towards a Cartesian representation? I don't really have any ideas, but figure it out and get back to me, and then I'm happy to accept your paper. So we said, okay. We received that decision letter around March of 2020, so we had to move everything online. So we did. Because of that, experiment 2A here is a replication. Basically, it's a combination of experiments 1B and 1C. I think it's just a cleaner design. We wanted to see if this would work in an online environment because we thought maybe people online would be noisy. And then in the 2 subsequent experiments, what we were trying to do is to ask, if we sort of had people completing this localization task in an environment that strongly implied Cartesian coordinates, would you start to see a pattern of errors that would be indicative of the use of a different format? A lot of people ask us, what about navigating in New York City? It feels very different from navigating in a field. And basically we were saying, okay, what does New York City look like in a psychophysical task form? And that's a very boring grid. No offense to anyone who is from there. So here's what we found very simply. Basically, we found exactly what you might expect. So in the replication case, same task we did before, Cartesian errors are still correlated and polar errors are not correlated at all. But at the other extreme, when we have people completing this task over this grid, which strongly implies Cartesian coordinates, we see that Cartesian errors are now no longer correlated and polar errors are highly correlated. And then when you have just the bounding square, it's somewhere in between. So the suggestion here is that it's not as if people are just using one coordinate system to represent where things are in space, but it's at least somewhat flexible depending on the context and what other information people have available to them. Now, you might think that this grid is a very heavy-handed way of implying Cartesian coordinates, and I completely agree, but it nevertheless stands that as a proof of concept, it is possible to show that people's Cartesian errors are uncorrelated when their polar errors are correlated, and I think that's really important for establishing that the previous results aren't due to some weird statistical artifact or something. So this ended up being our paper, and we published, I think the title of the paper is something like Humans Spontaneously but Flexibly Rely on Polar Coordinates in Visual Spatial Representations. But I just wasn't satisfied with that sort of vague title. And so afterwards, I was thinking more about what it would mean that we sometimes represent space in polar coordinates and other times represent space in Cartesian coordinates. And I started to ask myself if there's only one format, if there has to be one correct answer, or the answer might be more complex. And that's the question that I explore in this paper here. This is a paper that I'm very proud of. It just came out a few months ago. And basically here I advance the idea that often in, at least in vision science, I think it's very common to think about representations as necessarily distilling down into a single format. And basically what I argue here is that that may not be the right way to think about the way that information ought to be represented in mind. So just going back to this example of a computer that I gave at the start of my talk, in the computer case, things are often formatted in one particular way. And that is because computers are machines that are designed to complete single tasks optimally as much as possible. If you're writing a document in Word, you want the computer to do that thing in that particular way, and so you'll save it as a docx file and so on. But human minds aren't designed to complete single tasks optimally. They're designed to complete many tasks flexibly. You never know exactly how you're going to need to use a piece of information. And so part of what I suggest is that it might be helpful to store information redundantly and simultaneously in multiple formats, independent formats, so that you may use them in different ways. And just to give an intuition for a case where I think it's very clear that people use multiple formats, I make an analogy to the game of chess. So most people in this room, I assume, think about chess as being played on an 8x8 grid. The format of the game of chess is an 8x8 spatial grid. But to machines that play chess, they traffic not in the spatial grid of chess, but rather in the algebraic notation of chess. Right? So for example, you can say E4, and E4 refers to a tile on the chessboard, but it also is an instruction for how to move on the chessboard. It would mean, move the pawn in front of the king 2 tiles forward, essentially. A computer doesn't need to know anything about how that algebraic notation maps on to the spatial format of the grid. It only needs to know the relevant move set within that algebraic notation. And then there are grandmasters of the game of chess, or really just masters of the game of chess, who traffic seamlessly between these two things. So at one moment you're playing over the board, but then you look away and you can talk on and on and on in this algebraic notation for verbalizing the game of chess. And it's very, very important for those people playing chess at a high level to be able to translate between these two, because you don't know ever if you're going to be looking at a board, or going to be talking about a game, and so you can transition between these two seamlessly. And the point is just to give a sense of why it might be valuable to store information redundantly in 2 separate formats. And I argue that this may be true not just for how we think about the game of chess, but how we think about representations of space more broadly, or representations of other kinds as well. So what would it mean to suggest that we simultaneously redundantly represent information? I'm just going to very briefly present some preliminary work that's being done by a thesis student at Yale, Diego, who's working with me. And I want to show you how we think we're going to try to get at this question. So, and I'll show some pilot data. Basically, the idea is that we have this task where people are doing the same kind of localization task in everything that I've shown so far, except it's a memory task now. So they're going to see it on the screen. It's going to go away. And then the situation is going to reappear. You're going to have to place that blue dot back inside the space using your mouse. And here in this example, you can see that there's a landmark in the bottom left. there's also a boundary around the area, sort of combining some of the experiments that I showed before. But the critical part of Diego's design is that sometimes you'll only have the landmark, sometimes you only have the boundary, and sometimes, like I showed before, you'll have both. So we're creating a situation where at the time of encoding, you have access to both kinds of information, but at the time of retrieval, you don't know what kind of information you're going to need to access. So we have three different conditions: a landmark condition, a boundary condition, and both. And what we're asking is, do we see evidence of different formats in these cases? So this is a sort of, we're trying to create a canonical case where you can encode information in multiple ways, but you never know how you're going to use it afterwards. And it's completely uncertain for participants what condition they're in at a given moment. So just some preliminary analyses that Diego has done just to make the point that there might be reason to think that there's multiple formats that are being used here. The first thing Diego does is very straightforwardly just look at accuracy across conditions. So across the x-axis, we just have the landmark condition, the boundary condition, and both. And the y-axis is just raw accuracy in pixels. And so we find exactly what you'd expect if people are integrating this information when they have access to both. So in the landmark and boundary conditions, people do equally well, but when they have access to both pieces of information, they do better. There's a performance increase, again, suggesting that they can use both pieces of information and they will when they're able to. Another thing that Diego does is he looks at bias to or from the landmark broken down by condition. So here what you might think is that based on sort of other work in spatial literature, you might predict that people are biased towards the landmark when they can see it, but biased away from the landmark when they don't have access to it. And indeed, that's exactly what we found in the pilot data here. So when the landmark is present, people are biased a little bit towards the landmark. When the landmark is not present, people are biased away from the landmark. When people have access to both things, there's no bias either way. People are somewhere in between. Again, suggesting that people have access to and are utilizing both sources of information in some way. And then the question for us becomes, what can we learn from error correlations in these cases? So can we show that in the landmark case that people are exhibiting sort of a pattern of error correlations reminiscent of use of polar coordinates relative to the landmark? Maybe in the boundary case, you see something more like Cartesian coordinates. That's the idea. And indeed, we have done those analyses and it works out pretty well, exactly in that way. But this is just pilot data from 20 subjects online. And so I don't want to say anything too strongly about that. Really, all that I need to do is give people a sense of how we can address this question of simultaneous redundant formats all at once. So that's all for my talk today. I hope that everyone can get a sense of why we might want to think about this notion of format as cognitive scientists. And I also hope that people walk away with an impression that this notion of format is actually surprisingly accessible and often reveals itself through very small errors that people make it in very ordinary tasks. So with that, I want to thank all my collaborators and co-authors on this, especially Frank Kyle. And I also want to thank Diego for allowing me to share his work today. And I want to thank you all again for being so welcoming and for listening today. Thank you.
Thanks for such a great and thought-provoking talk. I'm interested in some of the individual differences when you were plotting the individuals along the y-axis, and some showing bigger kind of spontaneous use of the polar coordinates versus others. And do you think about those who show greater differences there? Are they more flexible or less flexible? And what do you think are some of the implications of that?
Yeah, so I'll sure repeat the question for those on Zoom who may not have been able to hear you. So the question is, what do I make of the individual differences? So if you recall those graphs with the green bars that I was showing before, there's a lot of variance in the size of that effect. Unfortunately, I think the answer isn't that interesting. I mean, I don't know. I think there are rich individual differences here that I think we can tap into using this approach. We haven't done a lot of that yet. But I will say, for anyone who wants to think about an error correlation analysis and something that they're doing, it's very noisy. It's a very noisy analysis. And so it looks very clean when I presented it up here. But if you actually look at, every person, there's going to be a lot of variance in what these correlations are. That's sort of the nature of the correlation analysis. And so I would be reluctant to overinterpret those particular individual differences that I've shown. We've done some other more detailed versions of this approach that I didn't talk about today. And there we can make a little bit more precise claims about individual differences. But so far, I'd be pretty reluctant to do that. I think what's really interesting to me is, let's say, in a case where people have access to both kinds of information, let's say, can we use this kind of approach to say, like, oh, this is a person who's really relying on a landmark, and this is a person who's really relying on the boundary. That only works if people are, in fact, doing one thing or the other. But we haven't gotten there yet. I think we're just at the beginning of sort of figuring out what this error correlation approach can do. And hopefully that's something we can use it for in the future. Yeah, Anna?
I'm wondering what you think the causes of errors are, and if that matters for you, and if you have to start thinking about implementation level when it comes to errors. I'm wondering, like, if you have something, if you have just like, so if you just get distracted or something, like, wouldn't that cause correlated errors in all cases, or how, like, what are the causes of it?
Cool, great question. So I'll again repeat for those on Zoom. So Anna asked a really great question about what the causes of these errors are, and specifically raised the suggestion or the concern that if someone just gets really distracted, it would, that would just be sort of a random source of error that would mess with these error correlations, or at least that's what I take the suggestion to be. That is totally true. So as I said, this analysis is very sensitive. Being a correlation analysis, it'll be thrown off by something like this. We do account for outliers. So on an individual trial basis, if someone's like more than 3 standard deviations or so away from their normal level of accuracy, we'll exclude that trial. If we don't do that, the analysis still works. It's just a little bit messier. So that's very important. First of all, we're removing outliers. And I guess I would just agree with you. The analysis could totally fail exactly for that reason, that there's a few rogue points here and there that aren't really reflecting any sort of representation, but just randomness. And we wouldn't see the results that we do. But I think the fact that we see the results anyway suggests that somehow this analysis is sensitive enough to detect things on top of that. So it's definitely a concern, and it's a fear of mine anytime I look at this data, because as we do different versions of this task, we just don't always know what people are going to be doing. So for instance, let's take Diego's test that I showed at the end there. When you look at accuracy broken down by condition, you see some unusual differences. Some people clearly are doing something weird only in the landmark ones. So what do we do with that? And there's lots of sort of tough questions for us there. But to answer the original question about the causes of these errors, I mean, I think fundamentally I'm thinking about this as noise in the representation of a single dimension and nothing beyond that. So I don't know if that counts as like a cause in the philosophical sense, but I'm thinking about it as noise. John, back.
Yeah, but I was curious about the sort of surprise that the default for preferred representation is the over coordinates that you asked. And I started wondering if that might have to do with something about precision, in which we can represent angle as the orientation as the vertical length. Does that play a role in the? It would seem that if your estimates of orientation are more precise, then you can have smaller, just noticeable differences. Say orientation, you prefer that, right? Because that number, that estimate would be more precise, and hence one of the measures.
So here the question is about whether there's sort of differential sensitivity to the dimensions that we're studying. You could extend that question, right? We could also ask about sensitivity to the X changes and the Y changes, and whether that is playing some part in our analyses. I guess I can't say definitively, but I will say that I have pretty extensively in other work studied sort of sensitivity to angular and distance changes of exactly this sort. And there aren't any major differences between angle and distance that we should be aware of. I think probably the bigger issue for our approach is that there are major differences in sensitivity depending on where in space you're doing this. So in the oblique regions, your sensitivity for angle changes dramatically, but for distance, it doesn't change at all. And I guess to the spirit of your question, you could totally imagine that our analysis is being totally driven by differences in those oblique regions, and maybe that has to do with angular acuity versus distance acuity. It certainly seems possible, although I would say that we've done so many variants of this task with so many different parameters where the points are in all sorts of different positions of space. I think it would be hard to think about that as an overarching explanation. But it's a fair point. I can't rule it out. We don't have an independent measure of sensitivity for each dimension in the data that I showed. So, yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. Something that got lost on me in the end here was, well, where on the one hand, in the final experiments you showed, You said the higher accuracy when they had both the landmark and the boundary was due to them using both systems. But it seemed to me like that version of the paradigm seemed rather similar to the initial experiments, where with the error correlations, you found a very clear bit of evidence that they were using the polar system and not using both.
Yeah.
You didn't say what happened to the error correlations in the both condition at the end, and I understand it's preliminary, but how do those pieces fit together?
Good question. So in all the studies that I've done before, so in the 6 experiments that I showed on the screen at the same time before, there's either a landmark or there's a boundary. Never both is the idea. So either people are localizing relative to the other shape on the screen or relative to a central black dot or to the bounding square or to the grid. Those are sort of the variants that we have so far. We've never tested a case where they have access to both. So when I was making a point about accuracy, I didn't word this the best, but there I'm not making a claim about necessarily them using both coordinate systems. I only mean that they must be using both pieces of information in some way because they're having more accurate judgments in that case. As for what happens with the error correlation, I think it's unclear. And I'll also say this, we don't really have a specific prediction about what the error correlation should be doing in the both case, because it gets kind of messy, right? On a given trial, someone might be using the landmark if it's more convenient. On a different trial, they might be using the boundary if it's more convenient. And it's kind of, the error correlation analysis doesn't work in that case. You need a pretty clear prediction about what they're using. So what we would predict is that in the landmark case, polar errors are uncorrelated Cartesian R. In the boundary case, it's flipped. And in the other case, it's noisy. That's our prediction. And like I said, that's mostly borne out from the preliminary analysis so far. One more question.
So I'm just confused about what formats are. Like, are they in our head? If so, what are they in our head? Are they in the world? Are they a relationship between us and the world? Where are they? Where are format?
Oh, that's a fun question. I define format as just the organization of information broadly construed, right? So you can have the same information in a 3x2 table or a 2x3 table, and that's a difference in format. In that case, a pretty superficial difference in format. But here, right, you're representing location, that's the information you're representing, and it's being organized in some different way, either through sort of a vector representing angle and distance, or through a vector representing x and y. So I don't know that I would get deep and philosophical about what I mean by format, but I've stuck to it's the organization of information broadly construed in all cases. And so I guess sometimes format is out in the world, sometimes it's in our heads. As long as we're talking about information and we have some way of construing that information, then it necessarily must be formatted in some way. And that's format. So I don't know if it's a satisfying answer, but that's my answer.
Okay, thank you both.